Good evening, everyone. My name is Mike Reynolds. I am the Executive Administrator of Wildlife Management and Research for the Ohio Division of Wildlife. We're going to get started at 7:02 as attendees continue to add to this webinar. So far, we've got 62 people logged in. So we'll get started with some introductions and let our presenter start at 7:02. I will tell you this evening, if you are familiar with this Teams Live function, up at the top of your screen, hopefully you see a Q&A box. That is where you're going to type in your questions tonight after Mike Ervin finishes his presentation. And Stanley Archer, our administrative professional, and myself will sort the questions and give those to Mike for answering at the end of his presentation. So we're going to wait for another minute and see who else joins us, and then we're going to get started this evening. All right, we're going to get started. People will continue to join us, and this presentation will be recorded. So if folks don't get an opportunity to see the whole presentation or have colleagues or friends that want to see it, we'll be posting this webinar on the division's website as soon as we possibly can, probably in a couple days. Again, my name is Mike Reynolds. I'm the Executive Administrator of Wildlife Management and Research, and we're going to give you a presentation this evening about our recent Waterfowl Hunter Survey results and how we're using those results to inform our 26 through 2030 zone alternatives that we will have to send to the Fish and Wildlife Service in August of 2025. So I'm going to turn it over to our Public Lands Program Administrator and our Mississippi Flyway Council Game Bird Technical Section Representative, Mike Ervin. And at the end of Mike's presentation, again, up at the top, you will see a Q&A box. That's where you're going to type in your questions. Stanley and I are going to see those questions, and we're going to publish ones that are relevant or that aren't redundant to previous questions, and Mike will work on answering those throughout the course of the hour-long presentation or at the end of his presentation this evening. So without further ado, I introduce Mike Ervin. Take it away, Mike, and I can see your slides.
Okay. All right, thanks, Mike. So I switched slide over there from the title slide to the outline that we'll go through today. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about the rule process. In particular, we got two waterfowl proposals out there right now, one of them for the 2025 waterfowl season dates, and then another one that will spend most of the presentation talking about the 2026 through 2030 waterfowl zone proposal. So two different proposals. Going to go through, they are different and they have a different time frame. I'm going to go through the differences in the time frame and the process for both of those, and I'll reiterate that again at the end. I'll go through the objectives of the waterfowl survey, so what we were trying to learn and really spend some time diving into why we asked the questions the way that we did. Go through the methods, so how we distributed the survey, the number of responses we got, how we filtered the data to ensure that we were looking at good information from Ohio waterfowl hunters. Dive into the results and our interpretation of the results, and ultimately show a draft zone map based on the survey responses and how we interpret that. Again, I'll reiterate the process for the waterfowl zones at the end so that folks know how they can make public comments on that, what the timelines are associated with the waterfowl zones, and then we'll open it for a Q&A. All right, so jumping into the rule process for the 2025 waterfowl season dates. Those proposals were given to Wildlife Council on February 19th. They're open for public comment right now. The comment period does close tonight. Stanley put the link to make a comment on the proposals in the chat. It's on the screen. It's also in the chat, so you should be able to get that if you haven't given us your comment on the 2025 waterfowl season dates. Please do that by tonight. There'll be a public hearing on those waterfowl dates for 2025 season on April 2nd, and then the Wildlife Council will vote on waterfowl season dates for next season on April 30th. So that's the first proposal, and that's on a different timeline than the waterfowl zone proposal. So the rule process for the waterfowl zones, the zones will be in place from 2026 to 2030. We're going to present a proposal to Wildlife Council on April 30th. There'll be a comment period open early summer where you can submit your comments online, similar to the process that's open right now for the 2025 waterfowl season dates. There'll be another public hearing on the zones. We're anticipating that'll be in July. Wildlife Council will vote in August on the waterfowl zones, and then the zones will be in place again for 5 years, from the 2026 hunting season through 2030. So new zones will not be in place next hunting season. It'll be a year delayed, starting 2026. All right, going to spend a little bit of time on this slide, the survey objectives. Only 2 objectives there, but spend some time kind of explaining and going into a little bit more detail on those. So we wanted to gather season date preferences that inform the proposals within the federal framework. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about federal frameworks. So waterfowl season federal frameworks are given to us by the Fish and Wildlife Service. Since waterfowl are migratory, they're regulated under the Migratory Bird Treaty Act and through the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. States have the ability to make state-specific rules within those frameworks, and they can be more restrictive but not more liberal than those federal frameworks. So part of the reason that we asked the date question the way we did, starting the 3rd week in September and ending the last week in January, is because those are the federal frameworks for ducks in the Mississippi Flyway. So we can't hunt before the 3rd week in September for our normal duck season, and we cannot go any later than January 31st. So we get some preference from hunters that they want to hunt in February, for example. The state doesn't have the ability to do that. It's part of a federal framework that we have to work within. Another part of the federal framework, and the reason that we asked, specifically the ranking question for waterfowl season dates, duck season dates in particular, the way we did, is because another framework is the adaptive harvest management framework that the service has. So we can have 60-day seasons under a liberal package. A couple generations of waterfowl hunters have known nothing but 60-day seasons, but it's a possibility every year that we're in a moderate or restrictive package, which would shorten the duck season. So we asked the questions the way that we did so that we'd have hunter preference, not only for a 60-day season, but also in case we get a moderate or restrictive package, we'd be able to look at the ranking information and use that in case we have a shorter, more restrictive season. Just like there are federal frameworks for duck season dates, there are frameworks for waterfowl zones. So there's a couple different options, all the way from having a statewide zone with up to 3 different season segments, all the way down to 4 different zones with a continuous season and some options in between. We've opted for a 3 zone in 1 split or 2 season segment zone preference, I guess, within the federal frameworks in the past. But there are some other options. Another piece of that federal framework for waterfowl zones is that the zones have to be contiguous. So we've seen some pretty creative maps sent to us with proposals on making zones that aren't contiguous. We can't have 2 geographically separated areas in the state that have the same dates and call them the same zones. So that's another one of those frameworks that we have to stay within that I'll talk about a little bit later. So the second objective there, gather county-specific data to inform zone proposals. So the map there on the lower left is one of the zone alternatives that we put out in a survey 10 years ago when we were going through this in 2015. We've known for a while now there's a difference in date preference between Northeast and Northwest Ohio. This was our attempt 10 years ago to kind of satisfy that and put it out there for hunters to rank. It didn't rank very high because I think we didn't get very precise with where that split was, where that difference in preference between the East and the North, or the East and the West in the North zone really was. So that's why we asked the questions the way we did in terms of having you identify the zone that you hunt in which county, so that we can get down to county-specific preference and really tailor the zones to meet the preference of the hunters. All right, so those are the 2 objectives. Going to dive into survey methods a bit. So it was an online survey that we delivered through Qualtrics. Qualtrics is the survey software that we use, and that's who the email came from. The email was sent to anyone who purchased a wetland habitat stamp in the past 3 years. We sent about 42,000 emails out. They went on December 9th. You can see about 1,600 of those emails bounced. So the emails were sent to the email address that you have on your customer account in the OWL system. So if you did not get an email from us, go into the license system and ensure that the email address on your customer account is the one that you check if you want to get future surveys or correspondence from us. About 800 of the emails were duplicates, and 10 of them were flagged by the recipient as spam. So we got notification if someone says this is spam. So we got some of those back. We also heard that the email went to people's spam folders. That's on the, not really something we can control. That's on the email server, whatever email that you use or the spam preference that you have set up on your account. So that's not really something that we can control on our end. We sent a reminder email December 18th. Typical survey protocols, send a couple reminders in hopes of getting boosting your response rate. So we received about 5,500 responses. It came out to about a 13% response rate. Some folks' initial reaction is that response rate's fairly low. It's actually right on par with what we see for normal customer surveys with regard to wildlife. So whether it's waterfowl or deer or small game, we typically see that 10 to 15% response rate. So nothing alarming to us there. That's pretty normal in terms of response rate. To ensure that we had a good data set that represented waterfowl hunters in Ohio, we removed some of the responses that we got. So if the email was forwarded, it was tagged as an anonymous response. So as soon as it gets forwarded, we don't know who the response is coming from. So we removed those. They were not included in the analysis. The first question in the survey for me would have been, "Are you Mike Ervin?" That was our attempt to ensure that the survey got to the person it was intended to go to. If you answered yes, then you got to see the rest of the survey. If you answered no, it took you immediately to the end of the survey, and we didn't use those in any of the analysis. One of the questions was whether or not you hunted ducks. If you answered no to that, we excluded that from the analysis. Again, we want to make sure we're talking to duck hunters. And if you did not provide a geographic location, so if you didn't tell us what zone or what county you hunted in, we removed that from the analysis. And I explained in the previous slide why those county-specific preferences are important and how we really intend to use those. After we filtered those responses, we got down to about 4,600 usable responses, which we feel like is a pretty good sample size. One more slide on methods here. We used a weekly ranking method for duck season dates. A couple of the other states in the Mississippi Flyway had used that method, and they really liked the information that they got back. So, we decided to use that. In previous surveys, we've given you very specific options, I guess, to select from with specific dates or specific questions that say, do you prefer the season comes in the second or third week in October? Or do you prefer a split? And if so, 5-day split or 12-day split. So we asked very specific questions that were hard to apply more broadly. And frankly, if we put 3 options in there and you didn't like any of them, we still made you rank them. So this method really gave the respondent the ability to rank the weeks and tell us really what they wanted and where they wanted it, the way we tied it to county. It was a ranking question, so we did score the responses. If you ranked a week first, it got 8 points. If you ranked a week second, it got 7 points, and on down the line to your 8th selection, it got 1 point, and then no points for weeks that didn't get ranked. So going back to those season frameworks, again, we started as soon as we could within the federal framework, and we ended the 4th week of July or 4th week of January to fit it in that federal framework. One more point on the methods here. Once we got the responses, so the map on the right-hand side are the number of responses that we got from each county. Counties that were over 40, where we got over 40 responses, we felt like that was a reasonable sample size. If a county had fewer than 40 responses, we grouped it with adjacent counties to get up to that 40, that big sample size. So we wanted to make sure we had a representative sample in a group of counties, that a couple responses weren't going to sway the results one way or another. So we did group adjacent counties in cases where we had fewer than 40 responses. All right, moving on into a couple of the results slides. So I threw a couple of these in, and I really want to focus on the responses to satisfaction with waterfowl zones and waterfowl dates, and make the point that the two are really inseparable. So this is a response to a question on satisfaction with the waterfowl zone, so the current zones that are in place. And you see that the highest satisfaction there is with neutral or no opinion, and that the preference for good or the preference for poor is kind of centered around no opinion. So this is really neutrality. There's no preference. Waterfowl hunters don't care one way or another about the current zones, is what this says. But the next slide, when we ask about your satisfaction with the waterfowl season dates for ducks, we see this skew towards dissatisfaction. So the two are not really something you can separate, and I think I'll show in a couple slides before we can fix I think we can fix the dissatisfaction with duck season dates with different geographic zones, and that's what we hope to do with the responses that we got. Throw one more response slide up here, just the raw survey responses. This year we did not align duck season and goose season opening dates in a couple of the segments and a couple of the zones. We did that based on previous preference, and so we wanted to ask the question again. We did get some phone calls and some feedback from customers on that. So we wanted to ask the question again, make sure that that's still the preference, and it is. You can see the preference there on the right-hand side. Folks would rather see goose season and duck season, set differently regardless really of the opening dates of either or. All right, so diving into the map, this is the map of the current zones. These are the number of survey responses that we got from each of the current zones. So on top, the Lake Erie Marsh Zone, the smallest pink zone up there by the lake. We got the fewest responses there. That's to be expected, is the smallest geographic zone. We saw similar number of responses from the north and the south zone, which we would expect since those are much bigger relative to the Lake Erie Marsh Zone. The next slide is going to show the season preference based on how we ranked them and then summed them for all the counties within each zone. So this is for the current zones in the information that we got back. Lake Erie Marsh Zone is on top. And this is where I'm going to make the point that zones and dates are really inseparable because we saw no preference for zones, but dissatisfaction with duck season dates. In the Lake Erie Marsh Zone, you can see the preference is only a week off on the beginning and a week off at the end of the season that we have right now without the split in the middle. Not too different from what we have now. The North Zone is almost identical to what we have now. And the South Zone is identical to what we have now with the exception of the wood duck season, the 9 days that we have in October, which you can see the blip for. So we saw no preference for waterfowl zones, but we saw dissatisfaction with dates. But when we ask folks to rank their season, they give us dates that are very similar to what we have right now. So this leads me to believe that the problem is with the zones and where the preferences are at, not necessarily with the dates the way that we currently have them. So the next slide is taking these responses and sorting by county and to get these as like as we can to try to accommodate as much of the preference as we can. And this is the draft map for the waterfowl zones based on the responses that we got. So I'll start in the South Zone. That's largely unchanged for most of the counties. We use a segment of the road boundary in Holmes, Wayne, and Ashland County that we've seen for the last 10 years. So that one's very similar. A couple of the counties in Western Ohio would move in this proposed map from the South Zone into a Northwest Zone. The Northwest Zone, the purple on the bottom, that season preference is similar to what we have in the South Zone now, very late in the season. Northwest zone with dates that are very similar to the current Lake Erie Marsh zone. A lot of those counties in Western Ohio prefer dates that are similar to what we have currently in the Lake Erie Marsh zone. And then that Northeast zone where we have season date preferences that are a little bit later. So this is where it's important to talk about the federal framework that zones have to be contiguous. We did see some individual counties with season preference that differed from what we have in the map here. An example, that's Wood and Hancock County. The preferences in both of those counties are very similar to the South zone, but there's no way to get there and keep a contiguous zone. So included those in the Northeast zone with a little bit later date preference. Although we know it's not quite what the hunters there, they want to hunt a little bit later, even into January. A couple of the county, or one county in particular in the northeast part of the state, wants dates that are similar to the green, the Northwest zone, but again, there's no way to get a zone there. So a couple of nuances here I want to hone in on with the draft that we have here. A change for us is going to county boundaries by and large, though we do have a couple roadway boundaries. So the inset map there for Wood and Lucas County is along the Maumee River. So we wanted to include all of that in one zone to avoid any issues with confusion with hunters on, if the zone went through the middle of the river, that would likely cause some issues with folks. So using Route 24, Interstate 75 there to draw the line should make that a little bit easier to find in the field. And then I already mentioned the road boundary there that we've used in the past in Ashland, Wayne, and Holmes County. That's unchanged from previous zone proposals. And then the next slide would be the season date preferences based on the feedback that we got with the draft map that I just had up on the last slide. So that Northwest zone would shift a week earlier than what it was, the way it was organized before in the current zone. So third week in October through the second week of December. Not a preference for a split there. We did not ask a specific question about do you want a split or not. But you can see in the slide next to it in the Northeast zone, even without asking a specific question, based on the way hunters ranked it, we can imply that they want to split there because of the preference. So Northeast zone would be, October, somewhere around the third week of October, very similar to, what we've had in the past, with those dates shifting a little bit later into early January. And then the South zone preference, similar to what we've seen for a long time, a lot of the preference towards the end of the season. And you do see that blip in the third week of October there, likely to pursue wood duck opportunity. All right, I'm going to reiterate the rulemaking process for waterfowl zones. This is a repeat from the slide that we had up earlier, but I want to make sure folks know the timeline and the process and how to comment. Proposed zones will go to Wildlife Council on April 30th, early summer comment period. Public hearing anticipated for July. Wildlife Council voted on it in August, and then whatever ends up getting proposed and passed by council will go into effect for the 2026 waterfowl season through 2030. So we won't have a change in zones for 2025. Anything that we're proposing here, would start in 2026. All right, and then last slide, we are going to put this presentation and this recording and the question and answer responses on the website. I can put the PowerPoint presentation out there as well. We'll send out a notification where that can be found on the website, and we'll open it for question and answer here till 8 p.m. if we have questions that long. If there's anything that comes in question-wise that we don't get to, we can publish our responses to those and put them out there on the website as well, in kind of a frequently asked questions type format. So that's all I've got for the presentation. Mike, I'll turn it back over to you for questions.
Okay, so again, what we're going to ask you to do on your screen, there's a Q&A tab. I'd like you to use that and type your questions in that Q&A tab, and I will publish them if they're appropriate questions or they're not redundant or they're not maybe they're not relevant for this evening, we won't publish them. But if they're relevant, we'll definitely we'll publish them, and Mike will handle them, or maybe he might defer some of those questions to me. And we'll do this for the next 30 minutes or so until we run out of questions. If we don't get through all of our questions, we'll definitely do that frequently asked question document and get that out to everybody. So I'm going to start looking in the new questions, and here we go. I'm going to publish the first one, and it's a good question regarding grandfathering and why some states have basically more than 3 zones, Mike. So I'll let you, if you can see that, go ahead and address.
Yeah, so I talked about federal frameworks, and one of the options is a 4 waterfowl zones with a split. A couple states have so 4 zones with a continuous season is within the normal federal framework. That is something that we could adopt in Ohio. Pennsylvania has something that's a little bit different. The service tends to grandfather, previously held regulations. So that 4 zone option with the split in Pennsylvania is something that's grandfathered and not on the table, not open to Ohio. The service isn't approving those proposals any longer. We get questions a lot about, can we shoot wood ducks in teal season like Kentucky and Tennessee do? And that's the same thing. Those seasons have been in place for a long time, and the service isn't granting those proposals any longer. So we could have a 4 zone set up in Ohio, but it would have to be a continuous season. We would not be able to have a split or different season segments.
And Mike, I've said Stanley can help. I'm sending a bunch of questions to the published for all to see. As I continue to read, Stanley can throw questions at you, or you two can tag team them.
All right, I see the next question. Oh, go ahead, Stanley.
I was just going to say, does this mean the South Zone might have a season from December to January without a split?
We saw we've had a season where we put 51 days towards the end, as late as we can go normally in the South Zone towards this framework, and we've left 9 days for wood duck season. That showed up in the preference in the past. Wood ducks are the second most harvested waterfowl species in Ohio, so I don't know what that'll be. We're not making 2026 season date proposals now, but we'll look at that. We'll look at the data that we got. We'll take public comment on, what folks' thoughts are. If that's something that we should consider moving forward. But the proposal that we put forward this year is very similar to what we've had in the past, with a 9-day early split and 51 days towards the end of the framework, as late as we can get it.
The next one, you said, whatever the council votes on in August would become the zones for the 2026 to 2030. But does the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service have to say the terms of those zones, or is that purely an Ohio decision?
Yeah, so it does. It is something that will be proposed at the federal level. The proposals that come from the states for waterfowl zones do go into the Federal Register. By and large, the service hasn't got involved in the state's decision making as long as we stay within the framework. So it does get published in the Federal Register. Ultimately, it's a federal regulation and a state regulation, but the service hasn't really got involved as long as the states stay within the frameworks.
On to the next one. Why is Maumee Bay not in the North Zone? I believe many hunters would want that in the North Zone.
So yeah, right now we have the bay, and then the 200-yard rule off of the Lake Erie Marsh Zone is the current rule, and something that on that map we had all of the lake again in the north or the northeast zone. That's something that was designed to allow folks to have opportunity to hunt in the bay or off of the shoreline and not have an issue with confusion on what zone they're in. So we have that confusion along the Ohio River where we border other states, and it's really confusing to explain to hunters which zone you're hunting in. So that buffer off of the lake, off of the Lake Erie shore is really there to, allow folks to hunt from the shoreline over the lake and be in one zone and not have that confusion on whether they're which zone they're hunting in. So, it's something we've got a lot of feedback on and something that we'd like to hear from folks on. And The 200-yard rule has been a challenge with the current zones, and I'd be curious what people, what the feedback folks have to say.
I apologize. I was reading comments, but there's a few in here that said, under the new zone map, which zone will Lake Erie be in? Did you highlight on that?
Can you still see the presentation, Stanley?
No, I took that off. I can.
Okay.
Oh.
Yeah.
I can go ahead and post that if you'd like.
That's all right. So right now, currently the waterfowl zone, with the waterfowl zones, the north zone or the lake is in the north zone, with the exception of the 200-yard buffer off the lake shore along the Lake Erie Marsh zone in Maumee Bay. So the way we have it proposed now, that wouldn't change. The lake would be in the northeast zone, but again, we haven't finalized this map. We haven't proposed it to council. We haven't opened it for public comment. So we would like to hear feedback on that.
Next one, will we see a teal season?
Yep. So, for 2025 anyway, the teal season will be shorter. It'll be a 9-day season. Again, that's based on the federal, federal feedback that we get. So that teal season will still be in place. It's not included in the regular duck season. That teal season is considered a special season. So we've been lucky and had 16-day teal seasons for a while. It is going to be shorter this year, but we will have a teal season. And that's information, again, that's stuff that the Fish and Wildlife Service sets based on how many teal were observed in the survey, and tells the states whether we can have a 16-day, a 9-day, or a closed teal season. But in 2025, we'll have a 9-day early teal season.
All right.
At least that's what's proposed.
How much consideration is given to the last 6 to 7 years of the warmer temperatures and the delay in freezing of the smaller water bodies that impact waterfowl in Ohio?
That's a very good point. And I've been doing this for about 15 years now, and I will say at the beginning of my career, we fly the midwinter waterfowl survey the first week in January, and early in my career flying over northern Ohio, you didn't count anything because it was solid ice. Now we fly over and it takes 2 or 3 days to survey the northern part of the state. We've seen that warming trend. We see ducks staying in Ohio later. In terms of if we gave consideration to that specifically in the survey, I would say we asked the hunters when they want to hunt. So that would be the consideration that we gave. If you guys are seeing ducks arrive later in the season, tell us that, and we ask you for your preference, and we'll set it on that. But we definitely have observed that. I've observed that over my career. We're seeing ducks stay longer in the state. We're seeing different species stay in the state. Tundra swans are a good example. A lot of them winter in Ohio now compared to going down to the coastal Carolinas. So, we've seen that change. I've been able to observe it over the course of my career, and I'm sure you guys have seen it as waterfowl hunters too. So, let us know what your preference is. If you've seen that, that's how that's going to manifest in our proposals is through your preference recommendations.
Ranking dates were asked based on what times we currently hunt, not what we'd prefer. Difference being we have not been able to hunt late January. Doesn't mean it wouldn't be preferred. Could this be rephrased or resurveyed? Excuse me.
We certainly have the option to resurvey again moving forward. We ask you to give us preference on where you currently hunt, but ask when you want to hunt. So we didn't necessarily ask your preference on when you currently hunt. It was where you currently hunt. So I think the information we got back was is valid, but we certainly have the ability to survey again if we need to.
Have you received additional feedback in the Lake Erie Marsh area regarding the need for a split to rest the marshes and the number of days before and after the split?
Yeah, so again, we didn't ask specific questions about splits, and we definitely have got feedback about how we asked the question. But like I showed with the northeast zone and even the current north zone, hunter preferences there for a split, it's pretty clear in the way that we asked the ranking question. So we did not ask that specifically, and maybe that's why we saw the results that we did. But we could see a little blip, especially when we combined the counties into the proposed northwest zone, but it wasn't enough to It's still ranked the 8 weeks still ranked as a continuous season, but I'm sure that's something we'll need to dive into more if we stick with using the survey data for the season day preference.
Again, are the islands in the northeast zone? What would it take to move the islands to the northeast zone and out of the northwest zone?
So the draft map I put up there included the islands in the northeast zone, and it would also include the current 200-yard buffer off of the current Lake Erie Marsh zone. We've had issues with that 200-yard rule. I'd be curious to hear feedback from hunters. That is something that we did not ask specifically in the survey and don't have great data to base it off of, but there are other proposals we could consider that would put all of the north east zone just go north through the lake and put all of the lake in the northeast or the northwest zone. That would really eliminate a lot of confusion, I think, hunting along the shoreline, and that would include the islands in the northwest zone along with the northwest zone dates. But that's it was not the map I put up today, but something we'd like to hear more feedback on.
We have a question. Are you sharing the zone proposal options tonight? If not, when?
So yeah, there weren't multiple options created. I just put up there a draft, proposal that is what we're considering giving to council now. Again, we'll present those on April 30th. So if there's strong feedback, let us know. But the proposal with the northeast and the northwest zone, in the moving the south zone boundary a little bit further south, is what we're intending to propose to council, or at least have it in draft right now to propose to council in April.
Why do you keep Funk Bottoms in the south zone when Killbuck is in the north zone?
That's a good question. Based on the preference that we've had, that line has been there, put in place. The preference from Ashland County, especially southern Ashland County, was to hunt, the south zone dates. The preference from the rest of Ashland County was to hunt the south zone dates. So the preference there, surrounding Funk Bottoms, is to hunt later. I think the local hunters, realize it's a flood control. A flood control reservoir that typically only fills later in the season. So the hunter preference is there to hunt late, and that's why we had Funk in the south zone. Killbuck and Wayne County, aligned a little bit closer with the northwest zone or the current north zone date. So that's why we decided to keep that boundary the way it was.
The preferred weeks of hunting greatly mirrored the current zone seasons. Was there questions that asked preference of season shift? My answer was influenced because of the framework that you've allowed to hunt.
Yeah. So we did not ask a question on whether you wanted the dates to change. We asked about satisfaction with current zones, which again was neutral. There wasn't satisfaction or dissatisfaction. It was just neutrality. We asked a question about preference with duck season dates, and we saw that the satisfaction was poor or skewed towards poor or very poor. So we didn't specifically ask if you wanted new dates, but we looked at satisfaction and said, okay, folks are telling us they want something to change here. And then we asked you to rank them. So it was interesting to see that, a lot of the preference is what you know. So if you haven't hunted the third week of September, for example, it's logical to think you wouldn't give that much preference. So we try not to bias the question with any kind of leading question up front. We just ask folks to tell us when they preferred to hunt. It is logical to me to think that folks prefer to hunt when they know, when they've hunted in the past. So we didn't ask those questions specifically, but we asked some questions about satisfaction and asked folks to tell us when they want to hunt. And that's really how we interpreted it.
Why can't Logan County stay in the south zone, knowing majority of our waterfowl do? They show up the first week of December.
Again, we looked at all
show up to the worst. Oh.
Yeah, we looked at all the preference in each county. That's why we asked county specific for county specific responses so that we could see when the majority of the preference was. And Logan County was one that We've had in the South Zone for a long time, but the preference is a little bit earlier in the season.
With most hunting taking place in I think that's Lima, the biggest concerns of the early season start compared to the other zones in the influx of hunters from the parts of the state in Michigan, which create a significant pressure and leads to overhunting. Will the future zone/dates plan to address that issue, those issues?
Yeah, so we've heard that for quite a while from the folks in the Lake Erie Marsh Zone. And, I put the sample size up there for the number, I put the current zone map up, and you see how small the Lake Erie Marsh Zone is, and you also see how small the number of responses are in the Lake Erie Marsh Zone compared to the rest of the state. So most of the waterfowl hunters do not hunt in the Lake Erie Marsh Zone and don't live there either. So I have a hard time, adjusting another zone's date to match the Lake Erie Marsh Zone. So there's not pressure up there, but we realize it's small. We realize that having those zones not come in on the same day leads to pressure in the Lake Erie Marsh Zone. I will say the preference that we saw kind of aligned along that third week in October. So I think that would solve the problem on its own based off the preference that the hunters told us. When they wanted to hunt. But, changing the North Zone or the South Zone to align with the Lake Erie Marsh Zone, is a tough sell just because the number of hunters, that we're talking about in the North and the South Zone.
I understand that public land hunting has an impact on hunters across the state. How does the Division of Wildlife use this information to impact their decision making on dates and zones? I understand some people are limited to public land only, but with the limited hunting opportunities on public land in the state, why is more consideration not given to private land hunters?
Well, we didn't really give preference one way or the other. That was, not one of the questions. We asked a question about, what types of habitats you hunt if you hunt on public and private land, but we did not use that in the analysis of when you wanted to hunt. So we didn't really split it based on whether you tell us you're hunting on public or private. All that stuff was lumped together into one analysis. So, we could look at the data that way. We didn't get into it. I don't know how we'd go about giving more preference to hunters on private land, and how that would kind of bias the input or sway the input one way or another for folks that can only hunt on public land.
We have a question. How will we be able to give feedback on zone proposal specifics going forward?
So we'll propose, whatever we end up with, if it's the draft map or if it's something that, that's edited between now and when we go to council, that'll go there on April 30th. There'll be a public comment period, just like there is right now for the 2025 waterfowl season dates. So you'll be able to go to the website, Division of Wildlife's website, click on the link and submit your comment. So when you go to submit the comment, it'll be the same format that we're using now for the waterfowl date. So you'll be able to click on the specific rule that you want to comment on, tell us whether you support it or not, put your name, email address so we can contact you, and then put your specific comment in there. So those will open for the waterfowl zones in early summer.
Why did you not get rid of the early season and extend it to later in the season? Because that is when migration is happening and the season is over with already.
Well, I'm trying to unpack the question there. So we talked about special teal seasons. If those are special seasons in addition to the normal duck season. So if we get 60 days to hunt in the normal season and the service gives us 16 days for early teal season, those are separate. We've had a 2-season segment where we've had an early split and then a late split, or early segment and a late segment within the normal season. But we, again, you saw the hunter preference there. We've been opening somewhere in that 3rd or 4th week of October. That aligns with the preference that we saw in the survey. If we're referring to going beyond the January 31st date, that's as late as we can go. So, otherwise the Lake Erie Marsh Zone and the North Zone are similar again to the preference that we saw in the survey. The South Zone is currently as late as we can go within the federal framework.
There's a comment here. Did you consider the 3 zones as the following: Lake Erie Marsh Zone, Lake Erie to Ohio Turnpike, Interstate 80, to the North Zone, Ohio North Pike to I-70, and then the South Zone, I-70 to the Ohio River?
So we didn't really consider different zone alternatives. Again, we asked the survey questions so that the respondents gave us county-specific information, and then we used the information that we had from each county or each group of counties to lump them into the zone that was most similar to their date preference. So we really didn't dive into looking at different alternatives in terms of different highways or interstates or whatever. That's very similar to the approach that we took 10 years ago, and we couldn't make it work. So that's why we asked the county specific question to really give us the ability to tailor the zone proposals to the preference that we received on the survey.
Have you noticed change in mallard migration?
Yeah, so like I said, earlier, we've seen changes in a lot of migration. It's later. Some things still happen, at similar times of the year. The scops still show up on Maumee Bay right around the end of October, 1st of November. That really hasn't changed much. I will say the changes that I see are when the ducks leave the state, if they're going to leave at all. We've had a couple warm winters. The last few, this one ended up freezing and birds left the state, but we've had a couple winters where it's mid-January and we're still seeing a lot of birds up on Lake Erie. That it doesn't freeze. The marshes freeze and thaw, and the birds are able to stay close into the lake. So definitely I've seen changes, but get a year like this year, it froze. We saw mallards and black ducks migrate through the southern part of the state. We've got a lot of GPS transmitters out on black ducks right now, and we saw that within the current season date, we were getting some of those transmitter responses in southeast Ohio and even down further south than that. So the change is really, I think we're overwintering more ducks as the climate continues to warm and we have warmer winters. We're going to see more waterfowl here later in the year.
Was there internal discussion about how narrowing some of the survey questions were in regards to where you hunt? Many hunters hunt all 3 zones in multiple counties across the state. The survey did not allow us to state this or give an opportunity to open-ended questions or comments.
Yep, I've got that question quite a bit, and I'll say it was a challenge enough to use the method that we did. So, we took a method that had been used, but it was new to us, and we added another step of asking zone and county specific questions, ranking them, and moving through analysis that we really hadn't done before. So that was enough of a challenge. It took us quite some time. Myself and another one of the biologists going through and analyzing the data with just one preference. As you add a second and a third county preference in there, it would have got very challenging to rank and figure out how to appropriately account for rankings for a second and a third preference from each hunter. So we talked about it, we thought about it, we definitely got that feedback, and I'd say it was challenging enough to deal with one. There's a lot of information with 5,000 responses, to deal with one preference, let alone 2 or 3. So we decided to keep it at 1, and I think we got good responses.
The early teal season appears to put an undue pressure on hunting areas, often pushing out local ducks and in some cases being abused by hunters harvesting other species. Is eliminating the season a possibility to help reduce pressure and protect local duck populations?
Yeah, I mean, it would be a possibility. It's closed until we open it. I think it would be an unpopular possibility. I'd kind of point at, the other species that might be around, that time of year would be, the wood ducks that breed here, probably some mallards that breed here. You tend to see some shovelers around that time of year, and wood duck populations are doing fine. We know there's some incidental harvest that goes on there. But it is a possibility. It is something we can propose. It hasn't been something that we've proposed, and we don't see that negative impact at the population scale for wood ducks to kind of justify that.
I think this comment is regards to earlier. So removing the 200-yard buffer and including Maumee Bay into the northeast zone?
That's not what we had drafted on the map. You know, that is something that could be done. You know, that is a proposal we could put out there to council. But you know, currently the way it's drawn, it includes that 200-yard buffer and the Maumee Bay in the north zone.
Was the change from main roads to county lines simply done to help eliminate some confusion amongst hunters?
I think so, you know, and that's how we collected the data. So, you know, most of our other wildlife regulations, all of our other wildlife regulations are county or township based. Waterfowl zones were the only ones that we based on roads. In some cases, there's a reason we did that, like, you know, in the why we did that in the past anyway. You know, and with this one, with the Maumee River, we wanted to make sure we weren't putting a zone boundary, you know, in a place that would confuse folks. So we opted to go with a road boundary. That boundary in Wayne, Holmes, and Ashland County is specifically around water bodies that we know are popular waterfowl hunting destinations. But yeah, county boundaries are how we regulate the rest of the wildlife in Ohio. So that's how we got the data from the survey. So that's what we decided to go with in this proposal.
If this is the only proposal, why will there be a comment period? The data has been provided for what hunters' preference is that created this proposal.
Yeah, that's part of our rulemaking process. There has to be a public comment. The same on the federal side, since this will be a federal regulation as well. It'll go in the Federal Register and be open for federal comment. So that's just a normal part of the rulemaking process.
So can you hear?
Oh, go ahead.
Stanley, can you hear me? Can everyone hear me?
Yep.
So we've got a little less than 10 minutes left. If you haven't seen your question, it's maybe because it's not relevant to the zone discussion. I've had several questions about sandhill crane season. I've had specific questions about specific wildlife areas. I've had a number of other questions as well. If you have any more zone-related questions, please ask them, and if they're relevant, we'll publish them for all. But we will have a transcript of all the questions and comments later when the recording is published on the website. So we got a couple more minutes. If you got a specific zone-related question, please enter it into the chat box, the Q&A box, and I'll get it published. But we're nearing the end of our time.
All right. With the new zone proposed, is there any chance that the new zones would stay the same as they have been, or is there enough data that the northwest part of the state will be changing somehow for sure, specifically Mercer County?
So again, we'll propose something, you know, probably, you know, something similar to that draft map that we put up there to Wildlife Council on April 30th. It'll go through that comment period. Council will have to, there'll be a hearing, you know, council will consider all the feedback that we get, and then ultimately Wildlife Council will have to vote it into state law, and it'll go through that same process at the federal level, but usually there's not much feedback. So, you know, nothing's in concrete yet. Even the map that we put up there today could change between now and when it gets proposed to council, but there'll be a public comment period. Then once it gets voted on in August, it would go into state law and into effect for the 2026 season, whatever that is, whatever map council votes on and ultimately passes, then that would go into effect.
We have a statement, keep the 200-yard buffer, otherwise it's a severe negative impact on layout boat hunters on Lake Erie.
Yeah, thanks for the comment. Mike, that looks like all the questions that got published.
I just added two more.
Two more?
Well,
okay.
Maybe their comments
popped up.
Maybe they're comments as opposed to questions, but in fairness for some of the questions about the 200-yard buffer, I added.
So the next comment down is kind of contrary to the previous comment. Please consider removing or modifying the 200-yard rule for safety concerns. Modify that rule to 25 or 50 yards instead of 200. Late season hunting drives the request. So again, we've had, you know, issues with the 200-yard rule, and you know, that's a tough one that's in place. Anytime there's two adjacent waterfowl zones over a water body, it you know, it's difficult for hunters to understand, and then you create some other issues. So thanks for the comment there.
All right, Mike, if that's mostly the end of the questions, there might be a couple more, and if we can't address them all, remember, we'll try to do a frequently asked question of document. But I think what would be useful for everybody that's still on the call is, again, remind them how they can comment on the 2025 season dates, and that there's a hearing next week on the 2025 season dates, and how this zone discussion is separate from the 2025 season dates.
So if you, next to the Q&A there's a chat function. Stanley, if you can put that link in there again to the season date comment period. So there'll be a link there in the chat. If you can't find it, you will you'll be able to go to our wildlife or to our website, or just Google comment on Ohio wildlife regulations, and it'll take you to the page where you can submit your comment for the 2025 waterfowl season dates. Again, those will be that comment period will close tonight, and once we get past that, Wildlife Council will have a hearing, and then they'll vote on it on April 30th. That'll be the same night that we propose the zone proposals that will go into effect for the 2026 through 2030 season, and then that'll have its own separate comment period, hearing and vote throughout the spring and summer coming up.
I'm checking the box to see if there's any last minute questions regarding the zones. Let's see, specifically the zones. Maybe Mike, you can address this question about why Funk Bottoms and Killbuck Marsh are in different zones. If you can, the source of water for Funk is a little different than Killbuck, and some of the preferences there. Yeah,
so we saw that late preference in Ashland County. That's where Funk Bottoms is mostly in Ashland County, kind of right on the boundary there between Wayne and Ashland County. That's a flood control reservoir that typically is closed or gets closed later in the season. We see big concentrations of waterfowl and waterfowl hunters. Once that area is flooded. So I think that's why the preference is later for Funk Bottoms and why that's been included in the South Zone in the past. Killbuck Marsh is has less water fluctuation, and the preference primarily in Wayne County, although Killbuck spans Wayne and Holmes County, is a little bit earlier and more aligned with that northeast zone.
Let's see here. As far as that goes, again, we've addressed the relevant zone questions tonight. There are some other questions that we might be able to respond to in a frequently asked question document. There were some goose season questions. There were some sandhill crane hunting questions. There was some we want you to manage waterfowl on public lands this way or that way type of questions. But by and large, Mike, I think you've answered all of the zone related questions as it pertains to that map. We will take your feedback, and there may be adjustments before we make proposals to Wildlife Council on April 30th for a zone map for 2026 through 2030. I would really like to thank everybody for not only joining us tonight. I had about a maximum of 104, maybe 105 attendees, and that we're still got 79 hanging on with us. So I want to appreciate everyone's participation tonight. And again, we will try to summarize some of this. And if you've got friends or colleagues or duck hunting buddies that didn't get to see this, we'll hope to post this on our website soon so people can take a look and understand what the survey results showed, as in terms of what we've known for a long time that hunters in the east part of the North Zone and the west part of the North Zone haven't seen things the same way. And we think this is a pretty nuanced approach to try to satisfy as many duck hunters as possible. So unless, Mike, you have any last comments? Thank you, Mike. Thank you, Stanley. And we're going to call this an evening.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks. Good evening.